Chapter 3. Catching Up.
Theraint came out and welcomed them. "Can you go anywhere without causing a ruckus?" Theraint smiled as they got out. This time Trisha started to defend herself, but again Theraint waved his hand. "It should have been done long ago," Theraint said. "Everyone knows why this had to happen except me," Taylor grumbled. Neither of them offered any more information. They got the bikes put into the garage. Theraint's staff returned the rental SUV and trailer. Taylor sat on a large deck with his legs kicked up on a comfy chair. Theraint handed him a pipe and he took a hit. "Thanks," he said through the smoke. "Amy and Tiffany are sleeping," Trisha said, walking out and grabbing the pipe before Theraint could grab it. She gave him her best smile, winked, and took a hit. Theraint laughed and took his own. "What now?" Taylor asked. "Scott," Theraint replied. "Scott," Taylor repeated. "Is there any chance for him?" Taylor asked. "I don't know," Theraint replied honestly, and they spoke of the best ways to get through to him. The next few days were blissfully quiet. Trisha appointed herself in charge of changing the look of Taylor's bike and trailered it off to a local shop. It would be back in 2 days. Trisha had been like a kid with stars in her eyes when she had picked out every part on the redesign. One thought she did not enjoy was the fact that it would now be faster than her own. She had had an advantage before. "What are you getting done to it?" he asked the moment the door cracked. "Pfft, like I'd ever tell you. You won't even be able to handle it," Trisha replied. "No, seriously. What are you doing to my bike?" "Pink." Trisha smiled and walked away. Taylor stood for a moment, stuck in a stare as she walked away. "Nah, you did not get my bike painted pink." He paused, and concern washed over his face. "Did you?" he asked as he started walking behind her. Tiffany was coming around to her new life and was dead set on finding and helping Scott. She had been through every emotion on the scale. However, she had decided that if there was a chance for Scott, then she would always hold on to it. Taylor knew that getting Scott to come with him would be difficult, if not an all-out fight. He looked in all the usual places with no luck. Taylor had one idea where he might be, but he wanted to get his bike back and ride up there with Trisha. Amy was deep in conversation with Theraint, almost all the time. She was completely interested in their history, but also Theraint's life. They laughed and talked late into the nights. When the bike finally came back, it looked completely different. Not pink, although Taylor had started to believe it would be. It was midnight black, with wisps of gray throughout it like clouds at night. The riding position was not changed much, although the handlebars dropped a little bit. It was the nicest cafe racer he'd ever laid eyes on. "I don't want to admit it," Taylor said, looking at the bike, "but it does look a hell of a lot better." Theraint and Amy nodded their agreement. "Takes a woman's touch, hun," Trisha replied. "It runs a hell of a lot better, too," she added. She started it, and it did not sound the same at all. Again, she was right. Very little on the bike was stock anymore. "Tomorrow morning we're going for a ride," Taylor smiled. "You're on," Trisha replied. That night, Theraint's staff served them dinner, and they did their best to have a good night. Amy even got a funny story or two out of Theraint, which even seemed to surprise himself. Taylor was struck by how Theraint had changed since they had come back. He seemed so mysterious before, and now he felt like he'd always been there. Taylor went to sleep that night with a feeling of trepidation. Trisha slept softly by him, and he finally got up and got out to the front room. He lit a joint and sat down. "Ooh, I thought I smelt that," Amy said, walking in. "Hey, what are you doing up?" Taylor asked. I was talking to Theraint," Amy said with a slight blush. "Amy, he's 500 years old. Don't you think he's a tad old for you?" Taylor smiled. "Well, he's a hell of a good-looking senior, I'll say that," Amy said. "So, big vampire on campus. How's all this shit treating you?" Amy asked. "I don't know. Sometimes I think I have it all in hand, and then I feel completely lost," Taylor said. "Well, you haven't changed much. You always questioned yourself to death before. Good to know you're still human. Sorta." Amy smiled. "What do you think of Trisha?" Taylor asked. "She doesn't take your shit. I like that about her." "She's the one for you. Anyone can see that from a mile off," Amy said. "I just worry that I'm gonna drag her into things she doesn't need to go through," Taylor replied. "Oh shit, Taylor. Honestly, when are you gonna learn? Trisha's part of this fight. Hell, I'm a part of this fight, and you didn't bring us into this. I don't care if you are the chosen one, Amy said. They both laughed at the statement. Trisha loves you. You ain't gonna get rid of her, Amy finished. They talked for a while, and when they went to bed, Taylor was finally able to get to sleep. The talk with Amy had given him some small measure of peace. The morning came, and Taylor and Trisha geared up for the ride. They sat in the kitchen in leathers eating breakfast with Geraint. Soon we will have to get you some documentation, Geraint said. What do you mean? Passports and the like. They left it at that, but both Trisha and Taylor knew something big was on the way. Again. Trisha winked at Taylor as if to say, "Bring it on." They geared up and rode out into the crisp morning. They rode up Parley's Canyon and went to a secluded spot on the Jordanelle Reservoir. The ride was fun, but Trisha had to admit it was colder than what she was used to. Taylor and Trisha got off their bikes and took off their helmets. Taylor smiled. His cheeks were bright red from the cold. "Wow, it's cold," Trisha said. Utah had started its turn into winter, and you could feel it in the air. Not many still ride when the season is almost changed, but Taylor always rode, until the snow forced him off his bike. "Wimp," Taylor said and smiled. Keeping with tradition, she hit him. They hiked for a few minutes, and then they came over a small rise. Taylor's heart lifted when next to a tent was Scott's bike. "He's here," Taylor said. At that moment, Scott came out of the tent. He was dressed in all black. Taylor was debating on how to approach Scott, when Scott looked directly at him. "I have nothing to say to you. Leave me alone," Scott snapped at him. "Scott, things have changed," Taylor replied, standing up and heading toward him. Scott smiled and put on his sunglasses. "That's the problem, Taylor. Around you, too many things change." Scott snapped back. He jumped on his bike and tore off to the road and then down the highway. Taylor doubled back to his bike. "I won't lose him this time. Get to the valley and let Geraint know what's going on," Taylor said. In one move, he had his helmet on and he tore down the highway after Scott. "Shit!" Trisha said, and got on her bike and headed back to the valley. She duplicated the route that she had taken in reverse. Taylor rode after Scott, catching glimpses of him here and there, but Scott had the advantage. His bullet bike was built for speed. Taylor's Cafe Racer was built for shorter hops. Taylor started forming a plan. He had a pretty good idea where Scott was heading, and if he could catch him at a few key points, he would lead him to the right place to catch him. Now the only question was, how? "Fine, you want to catch me? Well, bring it on, motherfucker!" Scott screamed into the wind. Instead of slowing down for the upcoming Heber City, he maintained a high speed through the residential streets. He then caught a ride on Highway 89, and they were on their way to Provo Canyon. As quite a few phone calls to the police were placed as the quiet citizens of Heber saw two metal flashes come through their town. He had chosen this route for a couple of reasons, but one of the main reasons was they would drive right by Deer Creek. Scott knew that the drive would hurt Taylor. His father had taken Taylor windsurfing on this lake. "Remember who was there for you," Scott thought to himself. Soon they were past the lake and headed down through the canyon. The walls of the canyon in sharp angles to the road. The turns were tight, which gave the advantage back to Taylor. He smiled. He was gaining. They dropped down into Orem, and soon, instead of catching a glimpse here and there, he saw Scott in his sights most of the time. "Cops are going to be a factor," Scott noted in his head. Scott shot out of the canyon, and as he had suspected, 800 North was blocked. He smiled. "I got this." He continued straight, and instead of going on 8 North, he went about a half a mile down the road, and he jammed his front brake in. The endoed bike, with a slight lean, was able to swing the back tire around 180 degrees. Taylor's brake light lit shortly after. He, on the other hand, power slid his bike around the 180 degrees. The move was not flashy, but a bit quicker in execution. Scott hit the gas and headed for 800 North. The difference was the roadblock was now 2 cars short. The police had gotten overzealous and tried to chase the two, and now their mistake was painfully clear. Scott laughed. The bike shot through the open roadblock. It did not go all as planned. He wanted to head south on I-15, but the police forced him to go north back towards Salt Lake City. Scott was already working on a plan. The new, larger highway allowed the speed to go up. He screamed by an exit and 2 highway patrol cars were next to him. Taylor was lagging behind, dealing with his own issues. They had been on an open road, but the officer forced him over. Scott was getting close to the side rail and he hit his brakes hard, the police shooting in front of him. He ducked off the exit and then back on the ramp on the other side. The move had confused the police enough that they had fallen behind him. "Fuck me!" Scott screamed. Taylor was right next to him. The move had slowed him down enough that Taylor had closed the gap. Taylor looked over at him and gave him a wave, and then he pulled his front wheel off the ground. He looked over at Scott, and Scott knew that there was an ear-to-ear grin on his face. Scott was pissed, but if honest with himself, he wanted desperately to launch his wheel into the air and even Taylor's move. But instead he gritted his teeth. He kept the front wheel on the ground and he hit the gas. Soon Taylor was again in the rear view, still riding his wheelie. Scott watched him put the wheel down. Taylor now settled in for the ride to Salt Lake City, Scott slowly pulling away from him. Although the police had tried a few tricks, including spike strips, there had even been a helicopter, but it had run out of fuel and had to turn back. They both knew that that would not last. Scott decided to blow through Salt Lake City. Traffic-wise, he picked the worst route. He would head for Idaho. Bikes can still go fast in traffic. He would have continued north, but another set of police cruisers were on him when they blazed through town, forcing him off the freeway, onto the 9th South exit in Salt Lake City. "Fucking assholes!" Scott screamed. This was not good for his situation. He groaned as they roared down West Temple as fast as he dared. It was about to get really tight. They had a few roadblocks that forced him to go on to South Temple, and again left on State Street. The 2 bikes went into Memory Grove. They dropped into a park that led into a canyon. Scott, starting to realize that the police were no longer in the chase. The small gully park had a small road aptly named Canyon Road because that's exactly what they went into. The high walls hid them from the first time for quite a while. They could not see the police in their rear views, although they could still hear them. Scott shot up the tight road. Now it was the 2 again. Scott tried everything he could to shake Taylor. The road ended and turned right into a gate. Scott lost his bearing and tried to make a turn, and then cut out of it. The move made him highly unstable. Taylor gunned his bike and hit Scott's back tire, and the bike slid out from under him. Taylor stopped, and 2 men popped out of the woods and grabbed his bike. Taylor walked over to Scott and picked him up by the arm. "Come on, we don't have time," Taylor said. "Fuck you, I'm not coming with you," Scott said. "Okay, that's fine," Taylor said, but he did not let go of Scott. He forced him into the back of the delivery truck, and Scott never had a chance to break free. The back door closed. Taylor, Scott, and Theraint sat in the back while a trusted member of Theraint's staff was driving. "Hey, thanks for the truck, Theraint. I would have hated to lose my bike." Taylor smiled. "I think Trisha would be very angry if you lost it. She just got it redone for you," Theraint replied. "Holy shit, what a fucking ride," Taylor said with a smile on his face. "This was all set up," Scott said. "No, man. When Trisha got word to Theraint," he took a breath, the adrenaline still running hard. "I don't know how, but he tapped into my helmet comm. Anyway, so a couple misplaced cops and we had an out," Taylor said. "And you had a trap," Scott said with a sour note. "Well, yeah. Fucking dumbass, you need to listen to me. Things have changed," Taylor said. "What the fuck ever," Scott snapped. But when they arrived at the house, Tiffany stood at the door and ran out to him. He looked a mess, but she fell into his arms. Tears were in everyone's eyes, including Scott. "I'm so sorry, baby. I didn't know," Scott said. They embraced and walked into the mansion. They all needed some time. Trisha walked over to Taylor. "Nice writing. Theraint had the whole thing on TV," Trisha said. "You're jealous," Taylor said, smiling. "Well, I could have outrode you, that's all I'm saying." "You were so jealous." Taylor smiled and kissed her. She tilted her head to the side. "Is that supposed to make it all better?" she asked. "Yep," Taylor replied.